Hi there, welcome to this webinar here with, I'm Steph Collins, I'm a paralegal in the team, and I'm here with my colleague, Kit Hooper. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm a senior apprentice solicitor, so hopefully you can hear us okay. If not, let us know.
So we're just going to be doing just a 15-minute webinar on acting as an attorney. If you have any questions during the time we're speaking, please do pop them in the chat and we can go through them at the end. Okay, so we're going to get started. That's just a little bit about our firm.
So I suppose we should start with thinking about what is mental capacity. So mental capacity is used to describe the nature of someone's ability to enter into a document known as the lasting power of attorney, and then to use that to make decisions. So mental capacity itself is governed by the Mental Capacity Act 2005. And if some of you have seen a lasting power of attorney, you'll have seen reference to this in the document. We've just listed the 5 main principles here. The first one being that the donor, and that's the person who has entered into the document and is giving their attorney those rights and responsibilities. The donor should make decisions for themselves unless it can be shown that they're unable. So that's done by way of a capacity assessment. A capacity assessment can be done by a GP or a third-party provider. You might pay a fee for them to do the capacity assessment. They'll sit down with the donor and basically assess whether they can enter into the document if they have capacity to do so. You should give the donor all the help they need to make a decision before deciding that they can't make the decision. So capacity, we call it fickle. So just because someone couldn't make the decision yesterday doesn't mean that they can't today. So they might have good days and bad days. So you should effectively just check in and refresh that every day and always give them the absolute most help that they can to make that decision for themselves. Number 3 is just because the donor makes what seems to be an unwise or eccentric decision, that doesn't mean they lack the capacity to make it. And that one speaks for itself. Number 4, any decisions you make for the donor must be in their best interests. Again, I think that's quite self-explanatory. One of the biggest questions we get from donors is always, what if they don't act in the best interests? And we would always say that anyone entering into a lasting power of attorney, the attorneys that they appoint, there should be no doubt as to whether they would act in their best interests. So if you think that they're maybe not very good with money and things like that, then I would definitely reconsider who those attorneys would be. And number 5 is anything you do on behalf of someone lacking capacity should restrict their basic rights as little as possible. Again, I think that one's fairly self-explanatory.
Okay, so moving on to the general duties of an attorney. So within the lasting power of attorney document, there is a page that sets out what the duties are of an attorney. And when you're completing the documentation, you should obviously ensure that everyone has read through that before they're signing. It is quite a large thing to take on being an attorney. So you want to make sure that your attorneys are actually willing and want to be doing all the things that they are agreeing to do. So again, touching on that, acting in the best interest of the donor, these documents are made with the outcome of wanting to protect the donor as much as possible. So everything you do should be to be in the best interest of the donor, every single decision. Looking at capacity is function specific. So that just means that just because the person can't make a decision about whether they should sell their house and move into a house in the middle of the woods doesn't mean that they can't choose what they're going to have for lunch or what they're going to wear that day or what they should buy for dinner. So different decisions need to be looked at specifically in relation to capacity, and just because you can't make one doesn't mean you can't make all the decisions. Within the document, you'll see that there's a choice as to how your attorneys make decisions. So you can either choose for your attorneys to make decisions alone or together. So it's either if they're appointed jointly or jointly and severally, or there's the different options, and they're explained within the document. You need to make sure that when you're making your decisions as an attorney, you are following what is set out within your specific document, because every person will have chosen something different. And just because someone else makes sure that everyone has to make the decisions themselves together doesn't mean that that's what's in your document. Obviously, as attorneys, you should act in good faith, honesty and integrity. The likelihood is the donor has chosen you because they trust you. So the hope is that you would be doing all of that anyway, but just obviously make sure that you are. And again, just touching on just because the donor makes an unwise decision doesn't mean that they cannot make the decision. That's a very, very important point to note. Just because you don't agree with the decision doesn't mean we should be stopping that decision being made. And obviously, we need to make sure that everything is kept confidential. You're acting on behalf of that person, and you're supposed to act as if you were them. So you're meant to make decisions as if they would make had they had the capacity to do so. And obviously, you don't want everyone knowing your details, just like we don't need everyone knowing their details. Just keeping that respect level and confidentiality.
So, as most of you may know, there are two types of lasting power of attorney, one that deals with your property and finance affairs, and one that deals with your health and welfare. So this slide is just dealing with property and finance. And we've just listed here some good practice really from attorneys to ensure that you're not breaching your duty really. So number one is keep accounts. I think that's quite self-explanatory, but it's always a good decision to keep accounts to ensure that you know what income they're getting, what their outgoings are. They may have quite high care fees. Is their pension covering that, for example? So accounts really are the only way that you're going to be able to keep track of that. Keep records of any decisions made. So, for example, if the attorney's decided that it was time for the donor to sell the donor's home and for them to move into care, keep a record, and it can just be like a brief sort of note on a file that says why you've made that decision and just shows that you've come together as attorneys to make that decision. Where necessary, take financial advice. So again, if you're selling a house, you may want to invest the funds of that property into a fund, so use the income towards their care. And we would always say take financial advice, from an independent IFA for that. Keep the donor's money and property separate from your own. So that's really key. Obviously, always open a separate account. Keep that money completely separate. You don't want anything to mix because you can have bigger problems down the line. Repaying any loans where necessary. So if they've got any creditors, definitely, repay those. You don't want to be hit with huge interest sums on loans that had been forgotten about, for example, when the donor had capacity, and applying for funding entitlements on behalf of the donor. So we put that there because the donor might be entitled to government assistance towards their care, for example, and you can have a benefits assessment done. So you really want to make sure that they're getting the most, that they're entitled to, really. And at the bottom, we've put IHT planning. And I think that's a question that crops up now and then, is that people want to gift, if they think, oh, mum's not got capacity now, but she's got quite a large estate and it's going to be subject to inheritance tax. Can I gift that money, get that out of her estate, for example, so I can reduce the IHT bill when she passes away? And we say no, because that's not acting in the best interest of the donor. It may be what mum would have wanted, but you need to maintain the status quo. You need to maintain things as they are, all for the donor, not for something that could happen on later on down the line.
Okay, so then looking at the duties under the health and welfare document, so as Kate said, there's the two separate different documents. Under the health and welfare, obviously we're focusing more on health and welfare. So that takes into consideration, so when we're looking at welfare, that's things such as, did mum get her hair cut every 6 weeks? We should be keeping that up. Like nail appointments, making sure nails are cut and making sure the shower routines are kept up, making sure that all of the general welfare things that you do for yourself every day are kept up, because people obviously are struggling to do that, and we need to make sure that we are keeping that up. Any vaccinations that a person would normally have, obviously we had COVID recently, and that brought into perspective a lot of vaccinations. If people opted against those vaccinations, we can look and see whether that person would want them now. Obviously, if they've always opted out, then we need to make sure that we're making a decision that they would have made, then they'd always opt out. Whereas if they were generally pro-vaccination and they would want them, then we, as the attorneys at health and welfare, are the people that make those decisions on their behalf. Again, looking at assessing the donor's capacity, that's something a health and welfare attorney would organise to get the capacity assessor out and check. And then obviously where medical attention is required, you would get that, but obviously you would want to do that even if you weren't an attorney, you would want to get medical attention where required. And then generally just daily routines. Does the person generally have breakfast, lunch and dinner? Do they generally have dinner at 2 o'clock, and just try and keep their daily routine as much as possible, because it can help with mental health. And also, you don't want, just because you start losing your capacity doesn't mean you want your whole life to change and to fit someone else's routine. You want to keep the routine that you've always had.
Yeah, and there'll also be restrictions on your duties sometimes. So there is a page in the lasting power of attorney document that deals with preferences and instructions. So 2 camps there. Preferences are very much, I wish, I would like. They're discretionary. You don't have to follow them, but obviously the guidance is there. It's quite clear that's what the donor wanted. And then there's instructions. So that is, you will do something. This is what I want to, will happen. So that's much more binding. So, for example, an example would be in the instructions would be something we call the discretionary management clause. So going back to the scenario that you've sold the donor's property and you visited an IFA to get those funds invested so that the donor is in care and you're getting the most out of those property funds, investing them, and the income can go towards their care. We said in the last slide that you need to get advice from an IFA, but if you think of the LPA as a contract almost, it's between the donor and the attorney, almost doesn't extend, the contract isn't extended to allow an IFA to manage those funds. So we always put a discretionary management clause there that says, I'm allowing an IFA basically to manage those funds on behalf of my attorney. And then, for example, the health and welfare, some of the preferences might be that the donor wants to stay at home for as long as possible. They may not want to go into care just because it's easier and you think it's best for them. They may want to have in-house carers, carers that move in with them and look after them. And therefore, because they've put that in their preferences, the attorney should do everything within their power to make sure that they can stay at home for as long as possible. Other examples include access to medical records. So if the donor is in hospital and you need to make decisions surrounding their health and welfare, we put that instruction in the LPA document so that the doctors can release medical information to help you make those decisions. And also a good example of one is investing in ethical funds. They may have clear preference about, that when that IFA takes the money and invests them, they want it, invested in an ethical fund. And then within the health and welfare LPA document, there's also a specific section regarding consent and refusal of treatment and life-sustaining treatment. So that's something that the donor would have thought carefully about at the time. They would have signed whichever box they wanted to go with, whether they do or don't consent, who they want that power, that decision to be with. So again, I think the key takeaway is always look at the document. Don't just assume that mum, dad, auntie, uncle, whoever would have ticked that box. Always refer back to the document and see what they said at the time of signing.
Okay, so we just wanted to note about stopping becoming an attorney, because I think what we see is a lot of people think that once you're appointed as attorney, that's it, you're attorney forever, and that's it, the document's done. Powers of attorney only have power during lifetime. So as soon as the donor passes away, that power of attorney document is now void. So that's when the will comes into play, if there is a will, or the intestacy rules. Obviously, that's a whole different scenario. But once the donor dies, the document is no longer. There are a few other times when the powers of attorney can cease to have existence. So I've listed a few of them there. You can choose to stop being an attorney. This is disclaiming, and you have to do a few different things to be able to do that, but that's something that you can do. If an attorney becomes bankrupt or subject to a debt relief order, they're looked at as unable to be able to look after the funds of the donor, because there's evidence that they are struggling to look after their own funds. So they aren't looked at as being the most suitable for being an attorney. And that's something that needs to be taken into consideration. Obviously, if you're divorced or separated, if you divorce someone, the likelihood is you don't really want them to be looking after your health and welfare or property and finances. So this is just popped in there. If that is something you do still want, then you can put that preference or instruction in. And then again, if you lose your capacity as attorney, again, you're not in the best place to be looking after someone else's finances. And that's, again, when you would stop being an attorney. There are some other ways in which you can stop being an attorney, but these are the main ones that people need to just take into consideration.
yeah, so I think that just concludes all the slides that we've prepared. We've just left space at the end there for questions. I think everyone's mics are on mute. So I think Steph said at the beginning, if you've got questions, just feel free to use the chat box, or you know, if you've got more specific questions about acting as an attorney, feel free to give us a call and arrange a meeting. But yes, I don't know if anyone's talking in the chat box.
No.
No.
Okay. Well, thank you for your time today. And as Kate said, if you have any questions, then do drop us a message or give us a call.
Oh, I think someone might be typing. Oh, thank you,
No worries
everyone.
at all.
Thanks so much.
You. Have a good day.
Bye.